Picture this moment if you can. 978 years after Christ, somewhere along the brutal coastline of what we'd call England today. A 16-year-old Viking named Bjorn stands waist-deep in the North Sea's freezing waters, watching everything he's ever known about warfare crumble in the span of a single heartbeat. The morning had started like any other raid, and when I say any other, understand that, for these people, raiding wasn't some weekend hobby. This was their economy, their foreign policy, their social security system, all rolled into one terrifying package. 30 longships cutting through the grey waters toward a Saxon coastal settlement, carrying 400 of the finest warriors Viksfjord could muster. These weren't desperate farmers with rusty swords. We're talking about professional killers who'd spent their entire lives perfecting the art of sudden, overwhelming violence. Bjorn's father commanded the archers, 20 men whose skill with the bow had become legend throughout their region. Think about what that means in a world where bringing down a seabird in flight could mean the difference between your family eating through winter or starving by spring's end. These weren't just accurate shooters. They were artists of death whose arrows could thread the gap between shield planks at 100 paces. But here's the thing about the North Sea that every modern person needs to understand. It's not just water. It's a living, breathing monster that can shift from ally to executioner faster than you can blink. And on this particular morning, as 200 Viking arrows rose from their bowstrings in perfect unison, that monster decided to flex its muscles. The wind gods. And yes, I'm using their language here because this is how they understood their world. The wind gods had other plans. A sudden gale, the kind that can flip a fishing boat or snap a mast, caught those arrows mid-flight and scattered them like dandelion seeds in a hurricane. Picture the scene. Arrows that should have been delivering death with mechanical precision, instead tumbling end over end, splashing harmlessly into the mud and surf, while Saxon defenders, who moments before were facing annihilation, suddenly realized they might live to see another sunset. What happened next was the kind of slaughter that burns itself into a young man's soul forever. Because when your primary weapon becomes useless in the span of 3 seconds, you'd better hope your backup plan is really, really good. The Vikings didn't have a backup plan. They had axes and spears and the kind of berserker fury that had terrorized Europe for generations, but they also had to cross 200 yards of open beach under a rain of Saxon arrows that the wind, in its cosmic sense of irony, was now helping to fly true. Bjorn watched his father's last arrow, the final shot from a bow that had never missed when it mattered, fly perfectly straight for 20 paces, before the wind claimed it. 20 paces of hope before physics and meteorology combined to send it spiraling uselessly into the sand. And then, a Saxon spear, thrown by some farmer who probably couldn't read his own name, found his father's heart with the kind of accuracy that only happens when the gods decide to make a point. Now, here's where the story gets really interesting, because what happened next would eventually change the nature of warfare itself. But it started with something much simpler and much more human. A 16-year-old boy staring at his father's body and asking the kind of question that obsessed minds are built on. Why? Why must the very element that carries their longships to victory betray their arrows in battle? Why should wind, the force that fills their sails and drives their commerce and basically makes their entire civilization possible, why should it become their enemy the moment they need it most? The survivors limped back to Viksfjord with empty hands and emptier hearts. In a fishing village where boys learn to read wind patterns before they learn to walk properly, where understanding the invisible currents of air can mean the difference between a successful voyage and becoming fish food, the shame of that failed raid cut deeper than any Saxon blade. Bjorn inherited 2 things that day: his father's bow and a burning question that would consume the next 20 years of his life. While his mother, Gudrun, struggled to keep their household running and his younger siblings cried for their dead father, while the entire village mourned their losses and tried to make sense of such a catastrophic defeat, Bjorn made a vow that his fellow villagers would later call both sacred and utterly insane. He was going to master the wind itself. Not understand it. Master it. Bend it to his will. Make it serve Viking arrows as faithfully as it served Viking sails. And if you think that sounds impossible, well, you're probably right. But here's the thing about impossible ideas that we forget in our modern world of smartphones and satellites. Sometimes the most impossible ideas are the ones that change everything. Sometimes the maddest dreams are the ones that reshape reality itself. The seeds of what would become the deadliest arrow innovation in medieval warfare were planted in that moment of absolute defeat, in the mind of a grieving teenager who refused to accept that what had always been must always be, who looked at the wind not as an uncontrollable force of nature, but as a problem to be solved. And trust me, before this story is over, you're going to see just how spectacularly and terrifyingly he succeeded. By 985 after Christ, 7 long years after that catastrophic raid, Bjorn had earned himself a new name in Vik's fjord. Not Bjorn the archer, like his father. Not Bjorn the warrior or Bjorn the wise. No, the villagers now called him Wind-Mad Bjorn, the fool who shoots arrows at storms. And you know what? They weren't entirely wrong. His workshop, built with the last of his father's raid-share silver, had become something between a temple and a madhouse. Picture walking into this place. The walls lined with hundreds of experimental arrows, each one representing weeks of painstaking work, prayers to Ulla the bow god, and consultations with Inga the seer about which offerings might appease the wind spirits. Some arrows had feathers set at angles that defied every tradition passed down through generations. Others sported strange grooves carved into their shafts with the kind of precision that would make a master shipwright weep. A few had bronze weights attached that made them too heavy to fly properly, turning each shot into an expensive lesson in failure. Think about the sheer audacity of what Bjorn was attempting here. In a culture where craftsmanship traditions were literally sacred, where the secrets of metalworking and boat-building were passed from father to son like holy mysteries, this young man was essentially declaring war on thousands of years of accumulated wisdom. Every failed arrow wasn't just a waste of materials, it was a small act of blasphemy against the old ways. But here's what made Bjorn different from your average village madman. He kept detailed records. While other young Vikings were learning the poetry of war, memorizing the great sagas, or courting the daughters of successful raiders, Bjorn was filling wax tablets with sketches of feather angles and wind patterns. He watched smoke from cooking fires dance in the coastal breezes. He studied how seabirds adjusted their wing angles to maintain straight flight through gusts that would send arrows tumbling. He observed village children playing with those little whirling toys that spin through the air, noting how the spinning motion kept them stable. His mother Gudrun feared he'd been touched by the grief madness, that peculiar form of insanity that sometimes claimed Vikings who'd lost too much too quickly. But old Eirik the Fletcher, the man who'd taught both Bjorn and his father their craft, saw something different. He saw a mind that refused to accept that what has always been must always be. And in a world where innovation could mean the difference between tribal survival and extinction, that kind of thinking was either divine inspiration or dangerous delusion. The breakthrough came not from the gods, but from a moment of pure, drunken frustration. Picture this. It's a cold autumn evening in 991 after Christ. Bjorn has just finished testing his latest design, arrows with feathers twisted at what his calculations suggested was the perfect angle. But when he loosed them into a mild crosswind, they careened wildly off course, some actually flying backward. In a fit of rage, he hurled his ale horn at the workshop wall. Now, here's where fate, physics, and fermented barley intersect in the most beautiful way. That horn spun end over end through the air, maintaining a perfect trajectory despite the workshop's notorious cross-drafts. While a traditional arrow would have been knocked off course by the air currents swirling through the building, the spinning horn cut through them like they didn't exist. For 3 days and 3 nights, Bjorn neither ate nor slept. His wife, Astrid, whom he'd married during a brief period when the village thought his obsession might be curing, found him hurling every spinning object he could find. Toys, tools, even sacred arm rings inherited from his grandfather. He was studying their flight patterns with the intensity of a monk copying scripture, and that's when the revelation crystallized, like winter ice forming on still water. Rotation defeats chaos. Think about a potter's wheel spinning fast. It stays perfectly centered, stable, almost supernaturally balanced. But let that same wheel sit still, and the slightest touch will make it wobble. The same principle that lets children's tops defy gravity, that keeps spinning coins upright when they should fall over, that same force might keep an arrow flying true against the wind's chaotic push. But understanding the principle and making it work, those are two very different challenges. And the second one consumed 13 more years of Bjorn's life in trial and catastrophic error. The mathematics involved would have impressed scholars in far-off Baghdad or Constantinople. Bjorn discovered that simply angling feathers wasn't enough. The angle had to be precise, matching the arrow's weight and length in proportions that seemed to follow hidden laws as rigid as those governing the movements of stars. Too much spin and the arrow would corkscrew wildly through the air like a drunken serpent. Too little spin and the wind would still claim it, sending it tumbling just like traditional arrows. He began carving spiral grooves into arrow shafts, each groove depth calculated through thousands of test shots. His workshop filled with the sound of endless experimentation, the twang of bowstrings, the whistle of arrows cutting air, the frustrated curses when physics refused to cooperate with ambition. Astrid learned to recognize the stages of his obsession: the muttering phase when he was close to breakthrough, the silent phase when nothing worked, and the truly dangerous phase when he would shoot in thunderstorms, testing his designs against nature's most violent winds. The neighbors thought he'd completely lost his mind when they saw him standing in lightning storms, loosing arrows into howling gales, just to see how they'd behave. But Bjorn was gathering data that no archer in human history had ever collected, learning how spinning arrows responded to wind conditions that would normally end battles before they began. By 998 after Christ, 20 years after watching his father die from the wind's betrayal, Bjorn finally achieved the impossible. His perfected arrows featured 3 goose feathers set at precisely 4 finger widths of angle, combined with shallow spiral grooves that ran exactly 2/3 of the shaft's length. The proportions had to be perfect. Even tiny variations would ruin the effect. When he loosed that first successful arrow into a crosswind that should have sent it spinning into the next fjord, and instead watched it fly straight and true to its target 200 paces away, Bjorn fell to his knees in the mud of his testing ground. 20 years of mockery, poverty, and obsession justified in a single perfect flight. The arrow spun through the air like those children's toys that had first inspired him, cutting through winds that would have scattered a traditional volley like leaves in a hurricane. It was beautiful, it was terrifying, and it was about to change the nature of warfare forever. But first, it had to prove itself in battle. And trust me, that proof was going to be more spectacular than anyone could have imagined. Word of Bjorn's success spread the way all truly revolutionary ideas spread in the medieval world. Slowly at first, carried by traders and wandering skalds who spoke in hushed tones of the mad Fletcher who had somehow tamed the storm itself. Most listeners dismissed it as typical saga exaggeration, the kind of tall tale that grows with each telling until ordinary men become giants and simple innovations become magic. But then came the Battle of Hjalmafjord in 999 after Christ, and everything changed. Picture the setup. 2 rival Norse clans locked in a bitter dispute over control of some of the richest fishing grounds in the northern seas. This wasn't just about pride or honor, we're talking about survival itself. These fishing grounds could feed entire communities through brutal winters, could fund raids that brought back slaves and silver, could mean the difference between prosperity and starvation for hundreds of families. Jarl Magnus controlled the disputed waters, but his claim was being challenged by Jarl Thorstein, a war leader whose reputation for tactical brilliance was matched only by his absolute ruthlessness in combat. Thorstein had never lost a battle, commanded some of the most experienced warriors in the region, and possessed the kind of cold strategic mind that could turn any situation to his advantage. But Magnus had something Thorstein had never seen before: 50 archers equipped with Bjorn's spiral arrows. It had cost him 300 marks of silver, practically his entire treasury. But Magnus was desperate enough to gamble everything on the ravings of a village madman. The battle should have been a straightforward affair. 2 shield walls meeting in the shallows of Hjalmafjord, axes and spears deciding which jarl would control those precious waters. But nature itself seemed to choose sides that morning. A howling gale rose from the mountain peaks, the kind of wind that normally ended battles before they truly began, because arrows became worse than useless. They became a liability to your own forces. Any sensible commander would have called off the archery entirely and settled the matter with cold steel. But Magnus, having spent his fortune on Bjorn's arrows, decided to roll the dice on 20 years of obsessive experimentation. What happened next defied everything those warriors thought they knew about combat. Thorstein's archers loosed their traditional arrows first, 100 shafts that should have devastated Magnus's advancing forces. Instead, the mountain wind caught them and scattered them like autumn leaves, sending them tumbling harmlessly into the water or skittering across the rocky shore. Not a single arrow found its mark. The sight should have demoralized Magnus's forces, but instead they pressed forward with grim determination, knowing their moment was coming. And then Magnus gave the signal. 50 spiral arrows rose from 50 bowstrings, spinning through the air with an eerie whistling sound that none of the combatants had ever heard before. The wind that had just rendered Thorstein's archery completely ineffective barely affected these new projectiles. They cut through the gale like spear thrusts, maintaining their trajectory with supernatural precision. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Imagine being a seasoned warrior who spent your entire life understanding the rules of combat and suddenly watching arrows that seem to ignore the laws of nature itself. These projectiles were flying straight as ship nails through winds that should have made archery impossible, finding gaps in shield walls, punching through mail and padding with mechanical efficiency. Thorstein's shield wall began to waver as men fell with arrows in their chests, arrows that had somehow navigated crosswinds that were bending trees along the shoreline. The survivors couldn't comprehend what they were seeing. Their own return. Volleys continued to scatter uselessly, while death kept spinning through the storm toward them with relentless precision. The battle became a slaughter, then a rout, then a legend that would be told around hearth fires for generations. Thorstein himself, the undefeated war chief, died with one of Bjorn's arrows through his throat, an impossible shot through wind conditions that should have made accurate archery a fantasy. The survivors who fled back to their longships carried stories that sounded like madness. They spoke of sorcery, of Magnus having made some unholy bargain with wind demons for unnatural power. They described arrows that seemed guided by invisible hands that could thread their way through hurricane-force gusts, as if the storm itself was helping them find their targets. But Magnus knew better. He'd purchased military revolution for 300 marks of silver. Within 2 seasons, everything changed for Bjorn. The village madman became the most sought-after craftsman in the Norse world almost overnight. His workshop, which had been a source of neighborhood amusement, suddenly required armed guards to protect trade secrets that were literally worth their weight in gold. Kings and jarls began competing for his services with the kind of desperation usually reserved for hiring legendary warriors or acquiring magical weapons. They offered land, silver, marriage alliances with their daughters, anything to secure guaranteed supplies of the arrows that had made archery effective in conditions where it should have been impossible. Bjorn, remembering 20 years of poverty and mockery, drove hard bargains. He established the Guild of Windmasters, creating a monopoly that controlled both production and training. The secrets of spiral arrow construction became guarded like sacred mysteries, with each craftsman bound by blood oath to protect the knowledge that had taken 2 decades of obsessive experimentation to develop. Young warriors began, traveling incredible distances, from Iceland in the west to Novgorod in the east, just to study under Bjorn's instruction. They learned not just how to craft the arrows, but how to shoot them properly. Because it turned out that spiral arrows required different techniques, different aiming adjustments, different understanding of how spinning projectiles behaved in various wind conditions. The revolution extended far beyond simple battlefield tactics. Naval combat, which had traditionally been decided by ramming and boarding actions after ineffective arrow exchanges, suddenly became a long-range chess match, where the side with spiral arrows held overwhelming advantage. Coastal raids grew more devastating because defending archers could no longer count on sea winds to protect their settlements. But perhaps most importantly, the psychological warfare aspect proved just as powerful as the technical advantage. Enemies facing spiral arrows for the first time often broke ranks before the battle was truly joined, terrified by weapons that seemed to mock the natural order itself. And this was just the beginning, because Bjorn's innovation was about to spread across the medieval world in ways that would reshape the entire nature of warfare. By 1018 after Christ, as Bjorn lay dying in his bed of rich furs and imported silk, wealth beyond anything his fisherman father could have imagined, he contemplated a legacy that stretched far beyond the gold and silver filling his strongboxes. The village madman had become one of the richest men in the Norse world, but more importantly, he'd proven something that would echo through the centuries, that the most fundamental assumptions about reality itself could be challenged, tested, and sometimes completely overturned. His 4 sons and 3 daughters had all mastered the craft of spiral arrow construction, but they'd inherited something more valuable than technical knowledge. They understood the deeper lesson that their father had paid 20 years of his life to learn, that accepting ancient limitations as unchangeable was the true madness. The Guild of Windmasters had evolved beyond mere arrow-making into something resembling what we might call a research institution, where young minds were encouraged to question why things must be as they've always been. The spread of spiral arrow technology followed the same routes that carried Viking ambition across the medieval world. Along trade paths and raid routes, from longship to longship, carried by warriors who'd seen the impossible, made real on countless battlefields. English fyrds, defending against Danish invasions, quickly learned that captured spiral arrows could be reverse-engineered, though without understanding the mathematical principles behind the design, their copies proved inferior to Bjorn's originals. But here's where the story gets really interesting from a technological perspective. When Norse traders reached the distant lands of the Rus, those Swedish Vikings who'd established trading routes deep into what we'd call Russia today, they discovered something that would have amazed even Bjorn. The steppe nomads, those horse-riding peoples whose entire way of life revolved around archery from horseback, had independently developed their own rotation-based arrows for dealing with the unique wind challenges of mounted combat. The exchange of knowledge that followed was like watching 2 streams of human innovation converge into a river. The nomads' understanding of how spinning arrows behaved when shot from moving horses, combined with Bjorn's insights about wind resistance, to create designs that were more sophisticated than either tradition could have achieved alone. This wasn't just cultural exchange. This was the medieval equivalent of international scientific collaboration. Byzantine Greek fireships, those floating fortresses that dominated Mediterranean naval warfare, quickly adopted the technology for their marine archers. Picture the psychological impact. Incendiary arrows that not only burst into flame on impact, but could maintain accurate flight through the chaotic wind conditions created by burning ships and Greek fire explosions. The combination of spiral arrow stability with Byzantine inflammatory chemistry created weapons that seemed to belong in apocalyptic nightmares rather than historical reality. The cultural impact of Bjorn's innovation ran deeper than its military applications. His story entered the saga tradition, though as often happens with folk tales, the skalds couldn't resist adding increasingly fantastic elements. Later versions had him learning arrow-spinning secrets from wind giants dwelling in mountain caves, or forging his first spiral arrows from fragments of Thor's own broken spear. One particularly creative saga claimed he'd made a bargain with Loki himself, trading his firstborn son for the knowledge of how to make wind serve human will. Christian monks arriving in Scandinavia as part of the slow conversion process faced an interesting theological dilemma. The spiral arrow represented either divine inspiration working through a pagan mind, God revealing hidden truths about his creation to whoever would seek them diligently, or dangerous sorcery that needed to be suppressed before it corrupted Christian souls. Most chose a middle path, carefully recording the technical specifications while attributing the innovation to God's mysterious providence rather than heathen ingenuity. This brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of Bjorn's legacy, the archaeological evidence. Modern excavations of Viking settlement sites across Scandinavia, Britain, and Iceland continue to uncover distinctive arrow points designed specifically for spiral shafts. The metallurgy is different, optimized for the unique stresses created by spinning flight. Workshop remains show testing ranges oriented to catch prevailing winds, with target areas positioned at distances that suggest systematic experimentation with wind resistance. Even more intriguingly, runic inscriptions found at some sites appear to encode fletching angles and groove specifications like sacred knowledge. These weren't just craft instructions, they were technological secrets preserved in writing systems that most people couldn't read, protected by the same mystical traditions that safeguarded religious mysteries. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery came from a 10th century burial site in Norway, where archaeologists found what can only be described as Bjorn's spiritual descendant, a master fletcher buried with experimental arrows that pushed spiral technology even further. Some featured multiple sets of feathers at different angles, creating arrows that could adjust their spin rate during flight. Others incorporated weighted tips that shifted the center of balance in ways that medieval metallurgy should have made impossible. The true monument to Wind-Mad Bjorn isn't found in any physical artifact, though. It's an idea that echoes through every subsequent age of human innovation. That patient observation, combined with systematic testing and absolute refusal to accept impossible, can literally reshape reality itself. Every archer who watches their arrow fly true through challenging wind conditions follows in Bjorn's footsteps. Every craftsman who questions traditional methods because they've glimpsed a better way. Every innovator who endures mockery while pursuing a vision that seems to contradict common sense. Every scientist who looks at a natural law and wonders if it might actually be a problem waiting for the right solution. The boy who watched his father die from the wind's betrayal became the man who made wind itself serve human will, proving that sometimes the maddest ideas are the ones that change everything. In a world where accepting limitations was considered wisdom, Bjorn chose to ask, why? And then spent 20 years refusing to accept any answer except the one that made arrows fly straight through storms. That, perhaps more than any military victory or accumulated wealth, is the legacy that truly matters. The demonstration that what has always been does not determine what must always be. That the impossible is often just the untested. And that sometimes, just sometimes, the village madman shooting arrows at thunderstorms is actually the sanest person in the room. The wind that once betrayed Viking arrows learned to serve them instead. And in that transformation lies a lesson about human potential that resonates across the centuries. We are not prisoners of our circumstances, but architects of solutions that haven't been discovered yet. The story of Wind-Mad Bjorn reminds us that the most important innovations often come not from accepting the world as it is, but from refusing to believe it has to stay that way.